Trapped on a lonely hill, 60,000 soldiers stood, surrounded by more than 300,000 enemies. The sky burned crimson, the earth shook, and for weeks, fire and death ruled the valley. It was not a battle. It was a siege, a test of endurance, genius, and will. Walls of earth rose against walls of men, and the fate of a continent hung by a thread. Here, discipline clashed with defiance. Steel met faith. Empire faced freedom. When the smoke cleared and the blood dried, a nation would fall, an empire would be born, and Europe would never be the same again. The year was 52 BC. The land of Gaul, vast forests, rolling hills, and hundreds of proud tribes, had endured years under the shadow of Rome. Julius Caesar's legions had marched across rivers and mountains, building roads, fortresses, and fear. To many Gauls, Rome was not just a conqueror, it was a chain tightening around their necks. But among them rose a man, Vercingetorix, the chieftain of the Arverni tribe, a warrior with golden hair, a voice like thunder, and a dream of freedom. He united tribes that had long fought each other, calling them to stand as one. For the first time in centuries, the scattered tribes of Gaul became an army. Gaul roughly corresponds to modern-day France, Belgium, and parts of Switzerland. Caesar, far away in Italy, heard the news of rebellion. He knew this uprising was different, not a mere skirmish, but a storm. He had 6 legions, about 30,000 Roman infantry and 5,000 cavalry, mostly Germanic allies. His strength lay not in numbers, but in discipline, engineering, and experience. Every Roman soldier was a machine of order, trained to fight, build, and obey without question. The Gauls, by contrast, were fierce but divided. Vercingetorix's army could reach 80,000 warriors, with another 250,000 from allied tribes ready to fight. They were brave, passionate, and fought with the fury of those defending their homeland. But they lacked the unity, tactics, and siege equipment of Rome. The stage was set. Caesar, the master of calculation and audacity, faced Vercingetorix, the master of spirit and unity. Two worlds collided, the discipline of Rome versus the wild heart of Gaul. Vercingetorix's strategy was unconventional. He avoided open battles. He ordered villages burned, fields destroyed, supplies hidden, a scorched earth defense. He wanted to starve the Romans, not fight them head-on. Every Roman advance found only ashes and silence. But Caesar refused to retreat. He understood that if he withdrew, Gaul would rise forever, so he struck fast, taking key towns, punishing defectors, and forcing the Gauls to seek refuge in a fortified stronghold. Alesia, perched high on a hill, surrounded by rivers and valleys. There, Vercingetorix prepared to make his final stand. As the legions approached the hill of Alesia, Caesar looked upon it and saw his destiny. He knew this would be no simple siege. This would decide the fate of Rome and of Gaul. The drums of war began to echo through the valley. One side fought for empire, the other for freedom. When Caesar's legions reached Alesia, now Alise-Saint-Irène in eastern France, they saw a fortress that seemed built by the gods. The city stood high on a hill, cliffs on 3 sides, and the Ouse and Osserine rivers guarding its base. It was a perfect stronghold, almost impossible to storm. Inside, Vercingetorix commanded nearly 80,000 warriors, with food, horses, and faith. He believed time itself would destroy the Romans. But Caesar saw something else. He saw not a fortress, but a trap, one he could close around his enemy. He decided not to attack the walls. He would let hunger and despair do the fighting for him. Day after day, the Romans began to dig. With axes, shovels, and iron picks, they cut into the earth. They built a wall of wood and stone circling the entire hill, 16 kilometers long. Towers every 80 feet, trenches filled with water, spikes buried beneath the soil. the circumvallation, Caesar called it, a ring of death around Alesia. Inside the fortress, the Gauls watched in disbelief. They had never seen such order, such silence, such precision. Each Roman legionary knew his task, his measure, his place. Every hammer strike echoed like a drum of destiny. Then Caesar did something no one expected. He began building another wall, this time facing outward. A second ring to protect from reinforcements that might come. A double siege, trapping his army between two potential enemies. A gamble that only Caesar would dare. In total, more than 25 miles of fortifications rose across the fields of Alesia, the greatest engineering feat of the ancient world. Days turned to weeks. Inside Alesia, food began to run low. Children cried for bread, horses grew thin. Vercingetorix held his men together with speeches of glory, promising that allies were on their way. A massive relief army from across Gaul. Until then, they would endure. Outside the walls, the Romans built fires every night. The flickering lights spread across the dark valley like a sea of stars. From the top of Alesia, Vercingetorix could see them. Tens of thousands of flames, each one a reminder that the noose around his people was tightening. For weeks, the fires around Alesia burned. Smoke rose over the valleys, a warning to all of Gaul. And the call was answered. From every corner of the land, tribes marched. The Aedui, the Senones, the Carnutes, the Bituriges. Men came with painted faces, bronze shields, and war chariots that roared across the plains. They came for their leader, Vercingetorix, and for freedom. By late September, the earth trembled. A massive relief army, nearly 250,000 strong, appeared on the horizon. The hills around Alesia filled with the echo of horns and drums. Banners of the Gauls fluttered like fire beneath the autumn sun. From the Roman ramparts, Caesar's soldiers watched the storm gather. One army inside the fortress, another outside in the fields. They were trapped, yet unbroken. When the attack began, it was like thunder striking from every side. Gaulish cavalry charged the outer walls, their horses foaming, their cries wild and furious. Roman archers loosed volleys of arrows. Ballista bolts screamed through the air, and the ground shook under the pounding of hooves. Caesar's legions held the line. Behind the walls, shield locked to shield, they waited for the right moment. When the Gauls reached the ditches, the Romans unleashed a storm. Javelins, stones, and burning pitch rained down. The front ranks of the Gauls fell in chaos, but still they came. Wave after wave, their courage greater than their fear. Inside Alesia, Vercingetorix saw the signal fires. He knew the relief army had arrived. He threw open the gates and led a furious sortie. Tens of thousands charging downhill into the Roman lines. It was chaos, two worlds colliding, steel against steel, flesh against flame. The screams of men and horses merged into one endless roar. Dust and smoke blinded the field. For a moment it seemed the Romans might break. But Caesar rode along the lines, his red cloak bright amid the storm, shouting, "Hold the wall!" For Rome! The men rallied, shields gleaming with blood and sunlight. With precision and fury, they counterattacked, driving the Gauls back toward their walls. As night fell, the valley was carpeted with bodies. The moans of the dying echoed between the hills. Neither side had won, but Caesar had held. The Gauls withdrew into darkness, their fires flickering like wounded stars. Both armies knew the next dawn would bring something greater, the final storm. And on that night, the fate of Gaul hung by a single thread. Dawn broke over Alesia, pale, cold, and silent. The mist clung to the hills like ghosts. No songbirds sang, only the low hum of thousands of men sharpening their blades. Inside the fortress, Vercingetorix gathered his chieftains. Their eyes were hollow, their armor dull. They knew this day would decide the fate of Gaul. He raised his sword toward the rising sun and roared, For our ancestors! For freedom! The warriors echoed his cry, a single thunderous sound rolling across the valley. Outside the walls, Caesar had already seen their movement. He rode along the inner ramparts, his red cloak snapping in the cold wind, his face calm, but his eyes sharp as steel. He knew the relief army was preparing its last assault. It was all or nothing. Then from beyond the hills came the roar. The Gaulish horde charged. Hundreds of war horns blared. The ground trembled. A flood of warriors poured down the slopes, shields glinting, spears raised, a sea of men crashing against the Roman walls. At the same moment, Vercingetorix ordered the gates of Alesia thrown open. From within, his 80,000 men surged out, charging uphill toward the same enemy. The Romans were caught between two fires. The clash was apocalyptic. Javelins darkened the sky. Arrows hissed like serpents. Men screamed as swords met flesh. Dust rose so thick it swallowed the sunlight. Steel rang, blood splashed, and the world became nothing but chaos and thunder. At the northern wall, the Gauls broke through the outer trenches. Roman centurions shouted orders, their voices barely heard over the storm. Caesar galloped there himself, bringing reinforcements, his elite Germanic cavalry thundering behind. They struck the Gaulish flank like lightning, slicing through warriors, spears flashing, horses trampling men into the mud. But the Gauls would not yield. Their relief army sent another wave. Tens of thousands storming forward, shouting the names of their tribes. Inside, Vercingetorix's men attacked again, hammering at the inner wall, scaling ladders, hurling flaming spears. Caesar's forces bent, but did not break. He ordered Labienus, his most trusted general, to hold the north at any cost. Labienus drew his sword and swore, "We will die where we stand." The fighting raged for hours. Blood ran through the trenches like red rivers. Corpses piled against the wooden spikes. Then as the sun began to fall, Caesar saw his chance. He rallied every reserve he had, infantry, archers, and cavalry, and led a counterattack from the heights. The legions advanced in perfect rhythm, shields locked, spears thrusting forward in unison. The Gauls, exhausted and bleeding, began to waver. Then the Roman cavalry struck from behind, closing the trap. Caught between walls and spears, the Gaulish line collapsed. Their cries echoed through the valley. And then, silence. Night fell over Alesia like a shroud. The screams had faded. Only the crackle of burning wood and the moans of the dying remained. Smoke curled upward into the cold sky, a requiem for the fallen. Where once thunder rolled, now silence reigned. The ground was carpeted with bodies, armor glinting faintly under the pale moon. Broken spears jutted from the mud like crosses on a grave. The rivers of Burgundy ran red. In the Roman camp, Caesar walked alone among the wounded. His armor was cracked, his face shadowed by exhaustion. He had won, yet his eyes held no triumph. Around him the legions stood in eerie stillness. There was no cheering, no celebration. They had stared into the heart of war and seen enough. As dawn crept across the valley, the horns of Alesia sounded again, not for battle, but for surrender. The gates opened. Through the smoke rode Vercingetorix, the mighty chieftain of Gaul, his golden armor dimmed by blood and ash. He rode slowly down the hill, while Roman soldiers watched in silence. When he reached Caesar, he dismounted, removed his helmet, and knelt. Without a word, he drew his sword and cast it at Caesar's feet. The sound of steel on stone echoed across the valley, a single note that ended an entire nation. Caesar said nothing. He looked down at the man who had united a people against him. And for a brief moment, he almost seemed to honor him. For in defeat, Vercingetorix stood taller than many kings. Behind him, the gates of Alesia opened wide. Tens of thousands of Gauls marched out, unarmed, broken, silent. Women carried their children. Old men stumbled through the mud. The Roman legions parted ranks, watching as the proud sons of Gaul laid down their freedom. That morning, the eagle of Rome rose over Alesia. It caught the first light of dawn, a golden symbol of victory forged in blood. But among the ruins, beneath the silence and smoke, a legend was born. For though Gaul had fallen, the name Vercingetorix would never die. The fires of Alesia faded, but their smoke would haunt history for centuries. For Rome, it was the birth of empire. For Gaul, it was the death of freedom. In the months that followed, Caesar swept across the land like a storm. Tribes surrendered one by one. The eagle banners of Rome rose over every hill, every river, every fortress that once called itself free. The conquest was complete, and Gaul became a province of the Republic. In chains of iron, Vercingetorix was taken to Rome. The people cheered when they saw him, the wild king who had dared to defy Caesar. But he walked through the streets with his head high, unbroken, his silence louder than any roar. Years later, during Caesar's triumph, he was brought forth once more, the final trophy of Gaul. As the crowd shouted Caesar's name, Vercingetorix was led beneath the marble arches and strangled in the shadows. Thus ended the life of a man, but not his legend. Rome celebrated its victory with gold, feasts, and parades. But among the legions who had stood at Alesia, there was no laughter, only memories of screams and fire. For they knew what the world would never forget. That empire is built not by glory, but by graves. Centuries passed. Rome itself fell to time and ruin. But in the heart of France, the story of Alesia endured. Children grew up hearing the name Vercingetorix whispered like a prayer. The man who stood against the might of the world and lost everything, yet gave birth to a nation. Even now, on the winds that sweep the hills of Burgundy, they say you can still hear the faint echo of his final vow. Better to die for freedom than live as slaves.